Let me tell you something about authority. The people who truly understand it never have to announce it, but the ones who don't? They're usually the loudest in the room. That morning in my courtroom started like any other. Routine cases, routine arguments, people walking in with problems, expecting solutions. But then, she walked in, not nervous, not uncertain, confident, too confident. Her steps were sharp, controlled, almost rehearsed, like she had already decided how this was going to go before she even entered the room. She didn't look around like most people do when they step into a courtroom. She didn't scan the environment. She didn't take in the seriousness of the space. She walked in like it belonged to her. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Confidence is quiet. But entitlement? It makes noise without speaking. She sat down slowly, placing her handbag carefully on the table, adjusting her posture like she was preparing for something other than a legal proceeding. I began the case. Standard process. Name, details, complaint, everything moving exactly as it should, until it didn't. Before I could even complete my first question, she raised her hand slightly, not asking permission, just signaling interruption, and then she spoke. Let's not waste time here. The room shifted immediately. Subtle, but real, because tone matters, and that tone? It wasn't cooperative, it wasn't respectful, it was dismissive. I looked at her calmly, gave her a moment. Sometimes people don't realize what they're doing until they hear themselves, but she wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly and added, I don't think you understand the situation. There it was, the beginning, not just confidence, but assumption that she knew more, assumption that she had control, assumption that this room would adjust to her. I didn't respond immediately. Because responses give people room to argue, and I wasn't here to argue. I was here to observe. I continued with the case, ignoring the interruption. But she didn't like that. People who are used to being heard immediately don't handle silence well. She spoke again, louder this time, more direct. Excuse me, I'm talking to you. That line changed everything, because now it wasn't just interruption. It was challenge. The courtroom went completely still. Even the smallest movement stopped, because everyone in that room understood something important. This wasn't going to be a normal case. I looked up slowly, met her eyes, and said calmly, You will speak when it's your turn. Simple, clear, final. But she smiled, not politely, not respectfully, confidently. That dangerous kind of confidence that comes from never being corrected. And then she said the line that always tells me exactly where this is going. Do you know who my husband is? There it was, the question that isn't really a question, the statement disguised as power, the belief that identity can override authority, the belief that status can rewrite rules, the belief that consequences are optional. The room didn't react loudly, but you could feel it, that shift, that awareness, that understanding that something had just crossed a line. I leaned back slightly, closed the file in front of me, and looked directly at her, not with anger, not with frustration, but with clarity, because I've heard that question before, many times. And it always ends the same way, I said calmly. No, a pause. Then I added, and it has no relevance here. That answer hit harder than anything else I could have said, because it removed the one thing she thought she had leverage. For a brief moment, she didn't respond, just looked at me, measuring, calculating, trying to understand why the situation wasn't shifting in her favor. But she wasn't done. People like her never stop at the first line. They push further. And she leaned forward again, her voice lower now but sharper, more deliberate, more dangerous. Maybe you should find out before you make a mistake. That was it. Not just arrogance, not just confidence, but a warning, or at least, she thought it was. I looked at her for a second longer, then said something simple, something calm, but something that changed the direction of everything that followed. The only mistake being made right now is yours. The room went silent, completely silent, because now, this wasn't just a case, it was a lesson, and it had just begun. The moment I said, the only mistake being made right now is yours, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed, not loudly, not suddenly, but enough for everyone to feel it. Because that sentence did something very important. It removed her control, and people who are used to control don't let it go easily. She leaned back slowly, crossing her arms with a composed expression, but her eyes told a different story. There was tension there now, Not fear, but resistance. That quiet kind of resistance that comes when someone realizes the situation isn't going the way they expected. She tilted her head slightly and gave a small, almost amused smile. "You're very confident," she said. Her tone wasn't aggressive. It was testing, measuring, trying to find a weakness. But confidence in a courtroom doesn't come from ego. It comes from position, and position doesn't move. I didn't respond to her comment. Instead, I opened the file again and continued reviewing the case details, because the more she tried to turn this into a personal exchange, the more I kept it procedural. That contrast matters. She watched me for a moment, clearly expecting a reaction when she didn't get one. She spoke again, this time louder. "I don't think you understand what kind of situation this is." There it was again, that belief, that assumption, that the rules were different for her. The gallery remained silent, but you could feel the tension building. People weren't just watching anymore, they were waiting. Waiting to see how far she would go, because everyone could sense it now. She wasn't backing down. She was pushing forward. Her lawyer leaned toward her and whispered something urgently, but she didn't even acknowledge him. That was becoming a pattern. Dismissal, control, authority, at least in her mind. I looked up and said calmly, "I understand exactly what this is." A pause. Then I added, "This is a courtroom." That line landed, because it reminded her of something she was trying to ignore where she was. She smiled again, but this time, it didn't carry the same confidence. It was thinner, more forced. "Where I come from," she said, "situations like this are handled very differently." There it was, another attempt, another layer of control, an implication that the system could be adjusted, that things could be handled, but not here, not in this room. I leaned forward slightly and said, "Where you come from is not relevant here." That statement settled heavily, because it stripped away everything she thought gave her advantage. Her posture changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough. Her shoulders tightened. Her fingers tapped once against the table. That was new, that was pressure. She looked at me more carefully now, not dismissively, not casually, but directly, as if trying to understand why none of this was working. And then, she played her strongest card. She leaned forward, lowered her voice just enough to make it feel intentional, and said, "My husband is a general." The words hung in the air, not shouted, not emphasized, but powerful, at least in her mind. The courtroom reacted subtly, a shift, a glance, because titles carry weight in most places, but not here. I didn't react, not even slightly, and that was the real answer, because silence can say more than any response. She waited, expecting something, recognition, hesitation, change, but none came. So she continued, "I don't think you want to create a problem over something this small." That line wasn't just confidence anymore. It was pressure, an attempt to influence, to shift the balance, to remind the room of power beyond it. But here's the truth about courtrooms: power doesn't walk in from the outside. It already exists inside. I closed the file slowly, looked directly at her, and said, "There is no problem being created here." A pause, then the line that shifted everything further. "There is only a problem being revealed," that landed heavier than anything before, because now it wasn't about her status or her husband or her expectations. It was about her behavior, her choices, her conduct, and conduct is something no title can protect. For the first time since she walked in, she didn't respond immediately. That pause, that hesitation, that moment of stillness, it was real. Her confidence hadn't disappeared, but it had been challenged, and once confidence is challenged, it starts to change. She leaned back again, but this time not comfortably, carefully, measured. Her eyes moved briefly around the courtroom, taking it in, really seeing it for the first time, because now she understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't a situation she could control, and that realization, it was just the beginning. There's a point in every courtroom where things stop being a performance and start becoming real. For her, that moment had arrived. After I said, "There is only a problem being revealed," the room settled into a silence that felt different from before. Not tense, not uncertain, but focused. Because now this wasn't about what she said anymore. It was about what she had already shown. She didn't speak immediately, and that alone was a change. Up until now, she had filled every gap with confidence, interruption, or challenge. But this time, She paused. Her posture shifted slightly less relaxed, more controlled. Her arms, which had been crossed earlier in a show of confidence, slowly uncrossed and rested on the table. That movement was small, but important. Because body language reveals what words try to hide. She leaned forward just a little and said, "I think this is being taken out of context." Her tone had changed, still composed, still careful, but no longer dominant. Now it was defensive, and defensiveness always means one thing: the person is no longer certain. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I let the silence sit for a moment. Because silence forces people to hear themselves, and what she was hearing now wasn't as strong as she thought. I looked down at the case file again and began reviewing the details out loud, clear, structured, factual, no emotion, no interpretation, just facts. And facts have a way of doing something very specific: they remove illusion. As I read, I noticed her expression begin to change, not dramatically, but steadily, the confidence in her eyes, the certainty, the control. It was starting to fade. Now she was listening, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. That difference matters. She tried to interrupt again. "That's not accurate," she said quickly. But this time, her voice didn't carry the same weight. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't commanding. It was reactive, and reaction means loss of control. I looked up and said calmly, "You will have an opportunity to respond." That stopped her immediately, because now the structure was clear. She wasn't leading this anymore. She was following it. Her lawyer leaned toward her again, this time more urgently, and whispered something. And for the first time since she walked into the courtroom, she listened. She didn't wave him off. She didn't dismiss him. She nodded slightly. That was the first real shift, because people who believe they're in control don't ask for guidance. They ignore it until they realize they need it. I closed the file halfway and looked directly at her. "You've made several statements in this courtroom," I said. A pause. She held my gaze, careful now, measured. I continued. "None of them have addressed the facts." That line landed exactly where it needed to, because it wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, and observations are difficult to argue with. She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped. That hesitation was bigger this time, longer, more noticeable. Because now it wasn't just a crack in confidence, it was a break in rhythm. Confidence speaks quickly, uncertainty waits. She finally said, "I just don't understand why this is necessary." And there it was. Not dominance, not challenge, but confusion. Because the situation no longer matched her expectations. She thought this would be quick, controlled, predictable, but now, it wasn't any of those things. I leaned forward slightly and replied, "It's necessary because you are here, simple, direct, unavoidable." That answer settled into the room like weight, because it removed every excuse. There was no outside solution, no influence, no shortcut, just process, and she was part of it. Her shoulders dropped slightly, not dramatically, but enough to show the pressure was real now. She glanced around the courtroom again, but this time, it wasn't with confidence, it wasn't with control, it was with awareness. She could feel it now, the attention, the silence, the shift in perception. She wasn't the person commanding the room anymore. She was the person being observed, and that realization is never easy. She looked back at me and said quietly, "So what happens now?" That question changed everything, because people only ask that when they realize they are no longer in control of the outcome. I closed the file slowly, looked directly at her, and said, "Now, we proceed." And in that moment, her confidence didn't disappear completely, but it stopped leading, and once confidence stops leading, truth takes over, and truth was just beginning to surface. When someone finally asks, "So what happens now?" they're no longer trying to control the outcome. They're trying to understand it. And that shift is everything. After I said, "Now, we proceed," the courtroom settled into a quiet that felt heavier than before. Not tense, not uncertain, but final. Because now there was no confusion left, no more assumptions, no more attempts to dominate the situation. Only process, and process doesn't bend. She sat still for a moment, her posture no longer relaxed, no longer confident in the way it had been when she walked in. Now it was controlled, careful, measured. Her hands rested on the table, fingers lightly touching, not tapping anymore, not restless. That nervous energy had turned into something else, awareness. I opened the file again and began going through the details of the case, step by step. No emotion, no interpretation, just facts. And facts, when spoken clearly, do something very specific. They remove all room for denial. As I continued, I noticed her expression shift again, slower this time, more visible. Her eyes weren't scanning the room anymore. They were fixed on the table in front of her, listening, processing, understanding. She didn't interrupt, not once. That alone told the entire story, because the person who had walked into this courtroom would have interrupted everything, but that person was no longer sitting in that chair. When I finished reviewing the key points, I closed the file halfway and looked directly at her. "Do you have anything to add?" I asked, simple question. But in a courtroom, simple questions carry weight. She looked up slowly. Her expression wasn't defiant anymore, wasn't confident, wasn't dismissive. It was careful. She opened her mouth slightly, then paused. That pause said more than any answer could, because it showed hesitation, and hesitation comes from realization. She finally spoke. "I think this has gone further than it needed to." Her tone was softer now, measured, almost controlled, in a different way, not to dominate, but to protect, to limit damage. That shift. It was complete. I listened without interrupting, because what comes after realization is usually an attempt to recover. She adjusted her posture again and added, "There's no reason for this to become a bigger issue." There it was, the pivot from control to negotiation. But courtroom respect isn't something you negotiate after you've already ignored it. The gallery remained completely silent. No whispers, no movement, just attention, because everyone in that room understood what was happening now. She wasn't in control anymore. She was responding to consequences. I leaned forward slightly and said, "This became a bigger issue the moment you chose how to conduct yourself." That statement landed firmly, because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. It was factual, and facts don't need emphasis. She exhaled slowly, longer this time, heavier. That exhale carried something her earlier words never did: weight, understanding. She tried one last adjustment, a softer approach, a different tone. "If anything I said came across the wrong way," she began. "That wasn't my intention." An almost apology, carefully structured, designed to acknowledge without admitting. I've heard that many times, and it never changes the outcome, because intention doesn't erase behavior. I looked at her calmly and replied, "Your intention was clear." That ended it completely. No argument, no reaction. No space left to negotiate. The courtroom didn't respond outwardly, but the shift was undeniable. Everyone understood. She wasn't misunderstood. She was exposed. Her shoulders dropped slightly, more noticeably now, because the pressure had finally settled. Fully. She looked down again, this time not briefly, but long enough for everyone to see. That's the moment every courtroom reaches. Not when someone argues, not when someone defends, but when they realize they've lost control of how this ends. I closed the file completely. The sound echoed softly in the room. Final, definitive. She looked up again, but this time there was no challenge, no confidence, only uncertainty. I met her gaze one last time and said, "There are consequences for how you conduct yourself in this courtroom." Simple, direct, unavoidable. And in that moment, there was nothing left for her to say, because the truth had already done its work, and now all that remained was judgment. By the time everything has been said, there's a moment where the courtroom becomes completely still, not because people are waiting, but because they already know. They know what's coming, and more importantly, they understand why. That's where we were now. She sat quietly, no movement, no interruptions, no signs of the confidence she walked in with. The woman who had entered that courtroom asking, "Do you know who my husband is?" was no longer the same person sitting there, because somewhere between arrogance and reality, something had changed, and that change is what every courtroom is built for. I looked at her for a moment, not with frustration, not with judgment, but with clarity, because this was no longer about her tone or her words or even her attitude. This was about accountability. And accountability doesn't require emotion. It requires decision. I opened the case file one last time, slowly, deliberately. The room was completely silent. Even the smallest sound, the turn of a page, the shift of paper, felt amplified, because everyone understood. This was the final step. I reviewed the last section briefly, not because I needed to, but because process matters. And process is what separates authority from assumption. Then I closed the file, gently, the sound echoed in the stillness of the room. I looked directly at her, and for the first time since this began, she didn't even try to hold eye contact. She glanced up, then looked away again, and that told me everything I needed to know. I spoke clearly. This court does not operate on titles. A pause. The words settled, no reaction from her, but they landed. I continued, it does not respond to influence. Another pause. The silence remained, and then the final line before judgment, and it does not tolerate disrespect. That was it. No raised voice, no dramatic tone, because truth doesn't need volume. It only needs to be understood. Her posture lowered slightly, more than before, because now there was no resistance left, no defense, no illusion. I placed my hands on the desk and delivered the ruling. Based on the facts of this case and your conduct in this courtroom, this court rules against you. A quiet reaction moved through the gallery, a breath, a shift, because even though everyone expected it, hearing it made it real. She didn't respond, didn't object, didn't argue. Because there was nothing left to defend. The outcome wasn't just decided by facts, it was reinforced by behavior, and behavior speaks louder than any argument. I leaned forward slightly and added one final statement. Let this be clear. A pause. She looked up again slowly, carefully, and I said, respect is not optional here. Those words stayed in the room longer than anything else. Because they weren't just directed at her, they were for everyone. Everyone who believes power can replace accountability. Everyone who thinks status can change consequences. I signed the final order. The sound of the pen against paper was soft, but in that moment it carried weight, finality, closure, truth. The case was closed. I stood up. And as I prepared to leave, I looked once more not just at her, but at the entire courtroom. And I said, court is adjourned. That was it. No drama, no shouting, no spectacle, just justice. And as I walked away, I didn't need to look back, because I already knew what was happening behind me. Silence, stillness, understanding. Because in that courtroom, she didn't just lose a case. She lost the belief that she could use someone else's power as her own. And sometimes that lesson is far more powerful than any verdict.